Okay, as I mentioned in the announcement part of this morning, I'm going to be preaching on a hard one this morning. It's apt to sting. And the reason I say that is because if I were a betting man, I would probably lay dollars to donuts that everyone in this room has at one time or another committed this act. I have. Not proud of it, but I've done it. I've learned my lesson. I don't do it anymore, but I have done it. And I think probably everybody else has done it. It's kind of like one of those things like lying. You know, if I were to say, how many of you have never told a lie, and a hand goes up, well, you just did, right? This is something that we all fall into. But it's something that, until I really started researching this, I didn't even have any idea how serious this is. So it might sting. I don't mean to step on anybody's toes. I'm actually stepping probably on everybody's toes. I don't mean to. I'm just the messenger, okay? That's all. I didn't write God's word. I'm just the messenger. So if I step on your toes, I'm sorry, I don't mean to. I'm going to give you two methods, a godly method and an ungodly method of how to deal with this. If it stings, if you realize, oops, then here's your godly method for doing it. 1 John 1:9 says that if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If you realize that you've done this, then go to God and say, I'm sorry. And then just don't do it again. That's all, right? The ungodly approach is to get mad at me and stomp out the door and never come back to church again. So I hope you follow the godly approach. And I'm going to give you a tip at the end of this on how you can make sure that you don't ever do it again. I'm going to help out with that. Try to get everybody to laugh at the end of a rough sermon. I've told you this before. When I was a little kid, there was a product on the market called Mercurochrome. Some of us old people remember that orange, deadly stuff, right? And if I would fall down and scrape my knee and go home, my mama would take this Mercurochrome stuff and put it on the scrape. And that stuff stung worse than the cut itself. And mama would say, that's just the medicine doing the work. So if this stings this morning, it's just the medicine doing the work. It's the Holy Spirit telling you, time to say you're sorry, okay? One other point before I get into this. Several years ago, it was the 25th anniversary of the Las Vegas church. I think you might have been there. Pastor Mott had come out because he was the evangelist that started the church, and he was the first pastor. And I'll remember this as long as I live. We'd gone through the communion, we'd done all that. Pastor Gerald introduces Pastor Mott, and he walks up with his Bible and does this. I've never seen him do anything like that before in my life. And he said, I'm not preaching off my outline. In the Las Vegas church at that time, there were a lot of problems. In fact, I don't think the church lasted more than about 5 or 6 months after that before it imploded on itself. And Pastor Mott was going to address some of those problems. And it was a hard one. God, that was a hard sermon. It was hard to hear. I'm sure it was hard for him to preach. You know, we like doing fun stuff, folks. We don't like doing the hard stuff. But during the course of this sermon, I was sitting right there, where the other gentleman that's a year older than I am is sitting right now. And he stared at me throughout that entire sermon. And I was thinking, wait a minute, I'm not guilty of this. What? Why me? And I asked him after, and he said, I was looking for a friendly face. You know, when we preach hard sermons, we get to see everybody's face. And I got to tell you, sometimes we see people looking like they're sucking on a lemon. We see people's fists tighten up. So sometimes we're looking for a friendly face. So if I'm looking at you it's not because I think you're guilty. It's because I'm looking for a friendly face, okay? So please understand that. Now, here we go. This morning I'm going to preach on the crime of meddling. The crime of meddling. I want you to turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 4, and we're going to look at verse 15. Now I'm going to tell you a story while you're turning there. Imagine it's a beautiful fall Saturday, Central Florida afternoon. You got the hot dogs and the hamburgers and the steaks out, and you're going to grill in just a few minutes, and you got your college football teams on, and you're watching the game, and there's a knock at the door. And you answer the door, and there's two uniformed police officers standing there. And you say, yeah, can I help you? And one of them says, well, are you Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, whatever the case may be? And you say, yeah. And he says, well, we have a warrant for your arrest. You're going to have to come downtown with us. And you're wondering, arrest? I didn't do it. What did I do? So you ask him, what's the warrant for? He says, you've been meddling. Meddling? As they stick the cuffs on you and throw you in the back of the car and take you downtown and book you. You know, most of us don't realize that this is a crime. We don't understand that this is a crime. If a crime is defined as an act or omission constituting an offense, usually a grave one against an individual or the state and punishable by law, we don't think of meddling being that, but I'm going to show you it is. Before God, it's a crime. Now, let's look at the verse. 1 Peter 4 and verse 15. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or as an evildoer, or as a busybody in other men's matters. That essentially is meddling, as we're going to see in this sermon this morning. And I want you to notice something. God places that activity in the same category as murder, as theft, and that word evil doing is translated from a Greek word that means criminal. This is a criminal activity before God. It's serious, and we're going to see why as we work our way through this. Now, that phrase, busybody in other men's matters, that's all one word in the Greek. It's a really long word, but it's all one, whole phrase is one word. It only occurs once in the New Testament, and it's right here in 1 Peter 4:15. And it's a compound word, which means it's made up of a couple of different words. I'm going to try to pronounce it. I'm sure I'll do it wrong, but it's pronounced allatri episkopos. Allatri episkopos. I don't know, 15, 16 letters in there. It's made up of allatri, which means not one's own, and episkopos, which means oversight or overseer. If you look briefly, just flip over to 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 2, and you'll see this, where Peter's talking to the elders, and he says, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof. That oversight, that's the word episkopos. Episkopos. It's also most frequently translated bishop. So the bishop is the overseer, right? I've taught you this before. He has an authority over a certain area that he oversees. This word, busybody in other men's matters, is someone that's not their oversight. Does that make sense? So a busybody in other men's matters refers to somebody that takes it upon themselves to interfere in another person's authority or oversight. Now, why would God have a problem with that? Why do you think God would think that would be bad? Well, it's God who ordains who is where, relative to churches, relative to governments. He puts people in places of authority, and he doesn't want somebody coming along and meddling in that. So we don't have the right to interfere in somebody else's authority. We don't. We don't have that right. So when you interfere with someone else's oversight or authority, you're actually interfering with something that was ordained by God Almighty. You're messing around with God's plan, and it makes God mad. He doesn't like it. And that's only one reason. There are some other reasons that we're going to look at. Now, if you turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul, now he doesn't use this exact term. As I said, that term only occurs once in the Bible. Busybody only occurs 3 times in the Bible. We'll look at the other 2 as we move forward, but they're a different word. But Paul, he doesn't use the word, but he alludes to it, and he uses himself as an example of somebody that doesn't do this. Okay? 2 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning at verse 12. For we dare not make ourselves of the number, or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. But we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. For we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, as though we reach not unto you, for we are come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ, not boasting of things without our measure, that is, of other men's labors, but having hope, when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule abundantly, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things made ready to our hand. Now what Paul here is he's describing what Peter means by that word. And he explains that even an apostle his authority has limits. Even an apostle's authority is limited. He has a measure of authority, not the whole thing. A measure is, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's going to tell you it's a limited portion. That's what a measure is. Now, let me try to describe it this way. Let's say you're going to bake a cake. And you got the recipe, and you got all these ingredients, and you look around and you go, okay, I've got everything I need, except I need 3 cups of flour and 4 large eggs. And I only have 2 eggs, and I don't have any flour. So you go to Publix, and you buy a 5-pound bag of flour, because that's usually how it comes, and you buy a dozen eggs, and you bring them back home again. Now, do you dump the entire 5 pounds of flour into the mixing bowl? No. Not unless you're going to make about 6 times as large of a cake as you were talking about. You get what's called a measuring cup, right? And you pour into the measuring cup until you have 3 cups of flour. Not the 18 cups that came in the bag. Your measure is a limited portion, okay? Now since we're in church, let's look at church. Okay? I have an authority as a pastor, as an ordained minister of the gospel. I have an authority, but you know where that authority extends to? The roughly 50 members of the Lakeland church. We have some visitors with us this morning. I told you I was going to pick on you. We have some visitors this morning from Cincinnati. You realize I have absolutely no authority over them whatsoever? None. Because they have a pastor in Cincinnati by the name of Tim Boffey. And Pastor Boffey has authority over the affairs of that church. I have the authority over the affairs of this church. So, does that give me the right to go meddle in the affairs of Cincinnati? No. No, if I do, I've become an allatri episcopos. That's not my oversight. I don't have a right to meddle in their affairs. They don't have a right to meddle in ours. And that's what, and it goes beyond just the church, folks, as we're going to see in a minute, because I'm the only ordained minister in here right now, I think. But all y'all, that's plural, you have authority as well. And it's important that you know what it is. So what Paul was saying here is that it wouldn't be wise to move beyond what he'd been given. And he wasn't going to do that. God gave him a ministry, and that was what he was going to do. He wasn't going to get involved in Peter's ministry. He wasn't going to interfere with Peter's ministry or John's or anybody else's. You say, well, now wait a minute, preacher. There's a time when Peter and Paul got into it over something, and Paul pretty much told him how the cow ate the cabbage. Wendy would say that was the very first come to Jesus meeting, you know. Paul got all over him. But if you go back and look at what happened, you know where that happened? In Antioch of Syria. That was Paul's church. And Peter was the one that was making a bad impression upon the members of Paul's church. And Paul let him have it right betwixt the eyes for doing it. So Paul didn't interfere in Peter. Peter interfered in Paul. Got his nose chopped off for it. Now, Pastor Gerald used to talk to me about a thing called the place of first mention. The place of first mention. It's not really a rule of Bible study, but it's a tool, if you will. And it many times brings great fruit. In other words, if you're studying a particular doctrine, go back to the first place in the Bible where that doctrine's mentioned and see what it says about it. You can gain all kinds of insight that way. So I want you to think about this for a minute. The word's not used, but the action is. Where's the first place in the Bible that anyone meddles in somebody else's affairs? Can you think of it? Can you think of where it is? Did Eve pick up her phone and call Satan and ask his advice? No. He just showed up in the form of a serpent and stuck his nose right in her business. How'd that work for the human race, folks? Not well. Not well. And that should tell you something else. When you get a hankering to stick your nose somewhere, that didn't come from God. You're listening to the wrong spirit when that happens. That's one of the things that Satan came up with. And if you listen to him too long, you'll go do it. So that's why I've got a method to help you with that when we get down a little bit farther in this. And now let's not limit the sphere or our measure of responsibility to just the church, because it goes way beyond that. Fathers, mothers, you have a responsibility to raise your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, but you don't have the responsibility to raise mine. That's my responsibility. And I will answer to God for how good of a job I do at it. And you'll answer for your responsibility, not mine. You think about this. Let me give you a picture of this. There are times when we make decisions that are wrong. And if a man makes a decision that's wrong, let's go back to the church. Let's say, there are a lot of decisions that I have to make in this church. Give you a little bit of insight so that you know so that you understand how this works with me. I don't know if it works this way with anybody else. But some of the decisions that I make in this church, when I stand up and make the announcement for that, you realize I've been working on it for about 2 or 3 months. I don't do anything rashly. It takes me 2 or 3 months to work my way through this. And one of the reasons that I do this, and I learned this from Pastor Gerald and Pastor Mott, I give God enough time, because he knows he knows already. And I go to him anyway and tell him, look, this is what I'm thinking. Am I right? I do that with my sermons. Am I right? If I'm wrong, stop me. And he's never failed to do it. So I give him plenty of time to let me know whether or not the decision I'm going to make is going to be okay with him. And if it isn't, there's times I'll wake up in the middle of the night with a Bible verse on my head that's some obscure verse. I don't even know how in the world I got that. And I go in my study and look it up and go, oops, well, I got to rethink this. And if he doesn't tell me anything, then it's good with him and I move on. That's one of the reasons sometimes it takes me a while to get around to this. I want to make sure that I'm on good footing. And you should do likewise within your measure, whatever that measure might be. If you're an employer, well, you've got employees you've got to take care of, and the Bible gives you instructions on how to do it. You don't cheat them. You don't steal from them. You treat them fairly. If you're an employee, you work for somebody else, I'll tell you something. There's one bit of advice that I gave to Blake that he actually listened to. I think it's probably the only piece of advice that he ever listened to me from. But it was a piece of advice that I gave him. I think we were in Las Vegas. Because I remember Conrad being there, and I told Blake this right there in the living room, and afterwards Conrad said, yeah, that's absolutely right. And the advice was, and this is to anybody that works for somebody else, if you're an employee of someone, then consider your supervisor as the Lord Jesus Christ and work for that on that job like you would if Jesus Christ was the one signing your paycheck. You'll do a better job. You'll work harder than anyone else ever has. And if you look at Blake, he took that advice and he went from a slick sleeve seaman apprentice to a chief petty officer in less than 10 years, which is unheard of because that's the way he works. He's always been like that. Back in the old days when he used to do retail, shot right to the top because of that little bit of advice. You just have to make sure that you're staying in your own world. Now, I want to give you a couple of examples of where Jesus Christ, God manifest in the flesh, refused to get into something that had not been given, he had not been given the authority for. Pretty good example, don't you think? If it comes from God manifest in the flesh. First, I want you to turn to Luke chapter 12. This is in the prologue to one of the parables. In fact, I think it was the parable of the rich fool. Luke chapter 12, we're going to look at verses 13 and 14. And one in the company, Jesus had been speaking, and one in the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. And he said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? You see, that man wanted him to do something that at that point in time, Jesus Christ didn't have the authority to do. He wasn't sent here to judge inheritances. That was not his due. He had a job to do. He was to come here. He was to live a sinless life. He was to give himself as sacrifice for our redemption. He was to start the church. He had a list of stuff to do, but that wasn't on the list. And he wasn't going to go stick his nose there. You might say that had he done that and arbitrated that dispute, he just took the job away from somebody else, didn't he? There's probably, I don't know, a justice of the peace maybe, or one of the elders at the gate, or somebody that has a legal responsibility to do that kind of stuff. And if Christ got involved in that, he would have been an allatri episcopos. He would have been a busybody in another man's matter. He would have taken somebody else's job away from him. Now, we know and we're told in other places that now he has been given the responsibility to judge. He didn't have it then, but he has it now. We know that. We're told in Romans chapter 14 and verse 10 that we will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And we know that at the end of this world, he will judge everything. But when did he get that? When was he given that authority? When he ascended into heaven after the crucifixion and sat down at the right hand of God. That's when he was given the authority to judge. So he judges now. He judges the church now. 1 Peter 4:17 says, for the time has come, the judgment must begin at the house of God. So he's judging now, but not when Luke 12 happened. He'd been promised that he would get it, but he hadn't gotten it yet. So that's one occasion. Now let's look at the other one. It's found over in Luke chapter 4, verses 5 through 8. And this is after the 40 days of him being tempted, after his baptism. And in verse 5, it says, and the devil, taking him up into an high mountain, showed unto him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said unto him, all this power will I give thee, and the glory of them, for that it is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I will I give it. And Jesus refused. The devil could have given him all the kingdoms of the world. He could have done that. He had stolen them from Adam. But Jesus knew that if he accepted that, it would really be illegitimate. Not only that, it would take the plan of God and smash it into smithereens. So he wouldn't do it. And it would have been sin if he did that, because that's not what God had planned. So here we have the perfect example. God manifest in the flesh that would not get involved in somebody else's affairs or take things the wrong way. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, we see this principle of future promises illustrated relative to us, because this is directed at the church. And here the Corinthian church, they'd been making lawsuits. They'd been going outside of the church to make lawsuits. They'd have two brothers in the church that got upset with each other, and rather than settle it themselves, they go out and sue somebody in the courts. And the church has already been given the responsibility of this. This is something the church does. We do it a lot, do we not? Whenever I stand before you and bring someone up on charges, it's the church's responsibility to make the judgment whether or not I've made the case or not. You know, I remember one time somebody asked somebody about Pastor Gerald, is he still excluding a bunch of people? And the response was, he never excluded anybody. You know, we've excluded, what, 15 people in this? I've never voted on any of them. I've never excluded anybody out of this church. I stand here and tell you, and you do the work, not me. Right? We make judgment calls in the church. In 1 Corinthians 6:1, Paul says, dare any of you having a matter against another go to law before the unjust and not before the saints? Verse 2, do ye not know that the saints shall, future tense, judge the world? And if the world shall be judged by you, are ye unworthy to judge the smallest matters? You see, he's basically saying if we're going to have this great responsibility when we get into heaven, shouldn't we be practicing now? within our own measure? You know how you get good at something? You practice it. That's how you get good. You practice. That's why I'm a better guitar player than I am a golfer. Because I've got about 1,000,000 times more practice on a guitar than I do swinging a golf club. If I swung a golf club as much as I've practiced guitar over the past 60 some odd years that I've been playing, I probably would have been on the PG. Well, no. I could probably break 100. You practice. There was well, I don't want to go there. I'm already running beyond. I'll tell that joke later. And now, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 3, it says, "Know ye not that we shall judge angels?" Look at that, he ups the ante. How much more the things that pertain to this life? These are promised offices, folks. Promised positions that we have. We don't have them yet, they're still future. We haven't been given this yet, just as Christ had not been given the authority to judge inheritance cases when he walked here on the earth. So Paul says we've got this to look forward to, but we ought to be practicing it, but we practice it within our measure. We don't move out of our measure. Look at Romans chapter 14 and verse 4. I told you this is a hard one. I know it's rude to drink water out of a bottle, but Josh can edit that out. Romans 14:4. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth, yea, he shall be holden up, for God's able to make him stand. Who are you to judge another, to form an opinion of another man's servant? Who the heck do you think you are? That's kind of a hard way of saying it, but that's what he said. And here we have the other side of the coin. Yeah, God's given us the promise of being judges and kings and priests in the world of tomorrow, but he hadn't given it to us yet. Now, and while we're to be making judgment calls within our measure and doing things within our measure in order to learn how to do that, we don't have the right to go outside of that. We simply don't. And what he's saying is if we decide to take this into our own hands to judge another man's servants for judgment calls that man makes, when it's that man's responsibility before God to make that judgment call and he alone will answer for it, if we then judge that servant, we've started to be presumptuous and we're meddling in another man's matters. Picture this. Let's say that Pastor Mott makes a decision relative to the Detroit church and I don't like it. Was it any business of mine to start with? No. But let's say I decide that I'm going to go talk to him about it. Let's say that I'm right. Probably aren't, but let's say I am, okay? And Pastor Mott makes a decision and the decision's wrong. And God is just getting ready to let him have it. And he's got his razor strap. You know what a razor strap is? Am I talking outside of my age group again? Back in the olden days when you used to go to an actual barber, right? And they would cut your hair, then they have a straight razor that they would use around your neck and around your ears. That used to be fun because they put that hot lather on there and then use a straight razor. Well, they've got what's called a razor strap hanging off the chair. And they use that to sharpen the razor and to polish it. One side's for sharpening, the other side is for polishing. It's about that wide so that the entire straight razor can fit with one motion, right? Made out of leather, good thick leather, and it works a lot better than a belt if you have to discipline someone. Okay? So, God's got his razor strap out. He's got it folded, and he's wound up, and he's just about ready to let Pastor Mott have it because of this decision he made, and I jump in the middle. Guess who gets hit? Guess who gets hit? Right in the way. And so you see, in Jesus' case, he would have been meddling in somebody else's affairs if he had decided to arbitrate that dispute. Now, let's look at some instruction from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. Judge not that ye be not judged. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you mete, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote of thy brother's eye. You know what a beam is? If you live in a house like mine, a really old one, and you got a crawl space underneath it, you can crawl underneath the house and you can see the beams. And the beams run from the front of the house all the way to the back. Big, huge, gigantic piece of timber designed to hold that entire structure up. That's a beam. You know what a mote is? A little bitty twig. Tiny little twig. So what Jesus is saying here, those that judge others, you got a beam in your eye and you're trying to help somebody that's got a speck? That's the point here. The practical instruction on this that he's given us in a word, we're not qualified to do this, to make some of these judgments. We just aren't. If you really want to break this down, that's really what it is. We're not qualified. And setting ourselves up to judge another, even if it's the intention is to help him in whatever problem he seems to have, it's self-exalting, it's proud, it's presumptuous, it's vain in terms of both vanity and being futile. And as Jesus says, it's hypocritical because we're guilty of the same stuff ourselves. And ours are worse because we got a beam in our eye, not a mote. And here's one that I haven't mentioned yet. And it's the great overriding problem, the elephant in the room, if you will. This abrogates to ourselves a prerogative of God. We're taking a job away from him. He's the judge, folks. He is the ultimate judge, not us. Okay, we've spent enough time on allatri episkopos. Let's look at the other word, translated busybody in the New Testament. We'll see it here in a few moments in the text, but the word is pere ergodzomai. The Greek preposition pere meaning around, and the Greek word ergodzomai meaning occupation or work, hence to work around. It suggests being busy, but not being busy at what you're supposed to be busy at. You're busy, but you're not doing your job. You're busy at something else. Think of it in terms of you got a piece of property. It's your job to mow this piece of property. It's a couple of acres and it's mostly lawn. So your job is to mow it. So you go out and you mow a little bit and then you go off and do something else. Then you come back and mow a little bit more and you go off and do something else. You always stay around the outside of the property, and that way you can look over the fence and you can watch and see what's going on with the neighbor. You can see what UPS is delivering to them. I wonder what they bought today. And you know those neighbors, you've all had an experience with the nosy neighbor, right? They know what everything's going on in the neighborhood. But they don't ever do their own stuff. They've always got their nose stuck someplace else. That is a pere ergodizomai, or however you say it. That's a busybody. Now, there's, as I mentioned, sometimes there's a cause for this. We all have 24 hours in a day to do something. Now you're going to spend some of them sleeping, but then you got a bunch of, but we're not basset hounds. I was mentioning to someone this morning about Gibson, my basset hound, that he sleeps 18 hours a day. Then he gets up and runs for 5 minutes and goes back and takes a nap. We don't get to do that. We don't get to lay around and sleep. So we need to stay busy. We need to be busy doing our own thing and not drifting off into somebody else's, because that's the biggest cause for this. When you've got time on your hands and you don't have anything to do and your mind starts wandering and that little red guy with the pitchfork starts whispering in your ear, you might tend to fall off into this. And Paul warns us against this. Look at 2 Thessalonians first we'll look at chapter 3 and verse 6, and then we're going to look at verses 10 through 12. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. Verse 6. Now we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw yourselves from every brother that walketh disorderly and not after the tradition which he received of us. Okay? So there's the instruction to withdraw from people that are going to do this kind of stuff that he's going to talk about here in a minute. Now look at verse 10, just so we can skip through this faster. Verse 10, for even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. There's the occasion of one of these busybodies. Now, them that are such we command and exhort by our Lord Jesus Christ, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. Some of you long-term members of this church remember that we had some members that just like this. We even took up donation to move them out here from another state. And the first thing they started doing was getting involved in stuff, begging off other people. He didn't want to work. And I remember I had to put my foot down on one of those occasions, because he had gotten the members of the church, without me even knowing about it, with a list of, well, I'll buy the battery, I'll pay for the dental work, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll do something. And by the time I get a hold of it, this church had formed an ad hoc committee and sliced the pastor out of it. And so I had to put a stop to it. And they got mad. Oh, that cut off their gravy train, and they got mad at me. Okay? And that's what was going on in Thessalonica. There were apparently some of the people in that church that misread Paul's first letter and thought that the Lord Jesus Christ was going to return tomorrow. Well, why do I need a job? I don't need to work. I'll just quit working, wait for him to come. He's going to be here tomorrow. But he didn't come. And he didn't come. And he still didn't come. And so these people, they don't have a job. Now they don't have any food. They start mooching off the other members of the church that did have a job. And that's what Paul's talking about. Then, since they don't have a job, they start sticking their nose in everybody's affairs. Got to spend the time doing something, right? You find somebody that does this, and I'll lay you dollars to donuts that you're probably got somebody that's got too much time on their hands. And they need to find a hobby. I heard, I think it was last week, that we got a young guy back there in the back of the room that took up guitar last summer. Good for you. Good for you. I'll have to have him over one of these days. Go learn how to play a musical instrument. Take up golf. We'll take you out and show you how bad we are, how bad I am anyway. Take up a hobby, do something. Don't just be idle. If you're idle, I got a quote here. I need to find it. Oh, here it is, Matthew Henry. Talking about this verse, Matthew Henry said, find it again, if we're idle, the devil in a corrupt heart will soon find us something to do. And he will. So Paul had to lay down the law to these folks. They started with a bad judgment call about what Paul wrote in the first letter. Then they deteriorated into annoying, meddling busybodies mooching off the church. Now, look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 13, and we'll see this same thing come out of here. 1 Timothy 5, verse 13, we're talking about younger widows. And it says in verse 13, and withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. You see idleness? See what it leads to? Now, the Bible frequently exhorts us to keep busy. And not busy work, being busy, doing our own labor, being busy. We're to stay occupied. In fact, God puts it directly in the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 4 says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. We're to work. And it's something, we've got people that volunteer. You know, I mean, I work all the time. My wife works. We're busy people. We work until it's time to go to bed. You should do likewise. If you do, you won't tend to fall into this other stuff. And unfortunately, we live in an age where there's more idleness in this society than there has ever been, ever. You think about this. God labored for 6 days and then rested on the Sabbath. That's our example, folks. John 5:17 says, my Father worketh hitherto and I work. They both work. It's kind of a busy job to run the universe, isn't it? To control all of the affairs that go on down here, to make sure that not just planet Earth, they got the entire universe to worry about. It's a lot of work. They're busy. And that's our example. Now look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 9 through 12. Talk so loud I just shattered one of my hearing aids here. 1 Thessalonians 4, 9 through 12. But as touching brotherly love, ye need not that I write unto you, for ye yourselves are taught of God to love one another. And indeed, you do it toward all the brethren which are in all Macedonia. But we beseech you, brethren, that you increase more and more, and that ye study to be quiet, and to do your own business, and to work with your own hands, as we commanded you. You know, I want you to consider something for just a few minutes. Oftentimes, God spanks us. He chastises. If you're one of his children, you're going to get chastised. If you never have, then you got problems coming. But he chastises us. And when he does it so that we don't fall into the same trap again. He does it so that we'll learn from our mistakes. That's why you discipline children, folks. You don't do it out of anger. You do it so that they don't go step in the same pothole again. And he does the same thing with us. Now, if he's in the midst of this and we go run off to somebody else rather than to him, it just complicates his job, and we're not going to learn the lesson. We might have to learn the lesson, have to go through this time after time after time after time in order to learn the lesson. Sometimes it's best to let the people go through what they got to go through so that when they come out of it, they don't ever do it again. If you're always there to rescue them, sometimes you make matters worse. You've inserted another factor. Think about this. The more people that get involved in something, the more factors there are. Instead of it being God one-on-one working with you to help you through the problem, now you got 14 people in here. And the chances of confusion, the chances of misdirection, it just multiplies exponentially. So Paul's advice here is to increase in love for the brethren by trying to live quietly, unobtrusively, by minding your own affairs and keeping yourself busy in your own work. That's how you increase in love for the brethren. That way, when God comes around to teach somebody a lesson, they might learn the lesson. Now, some might say there's a seeming paradox here. Turn over to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4. Where Paul says, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. You say, wait a minute, that looks like a contradiction of what you've been saying, preacher. It's not. It really isn't. And it's resolved really easy. All you got to do is follow the golden rule. That's all. Follow the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Simple, right? Simple. Yeah, we're to help. We're to look out for other people's interests. But let me ask you a question. How often do you want people to meddle in your lives? If I were to ask you the question, do you want somebody to come along and interfere in your affairs? I would venture a guess 99.9% of you would say, heck no. Well, then do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You don't want people messing in your affairs, right? So don't mess with theirs. Simple. Unless they ask you for it. If I have a problem that I can't solve, I'll pick up the phone and call somebody and ask for help. And when I ask for help, then they're not meddling to give me their advice because I asked for it. But if I don't ask for it and they just decide to give it to me anyway, they're meddling. They're being a busybody. And we've already seen that that's a crime. Let's say we have a couple in the church that's having marriage problems, okay? A busybody would just jump right in the middle of it with their notepad and their pen and say, okay, how do I help? A godly person would say, you know what? I'm sorry, I don't mean to be pointing at you. I'll point over here. They're having a problem, okay? I'll pray for them. I'll pray for them. And if they need help, they'll ask for it. I think every one of you that's a member of this church at one time or another, and probably more often than you want to remember, you've heard me say, if you need anything, give me a call. Well, there it is. If you call, I'm going to help. If you don't, you're on your own. Figure it out for yourself, because I'm not going to meddle in your affairs, because I don't want you meddling in mine. The golden rule. So if people are having a problem, we ought to build them up and edify them. Yeah, if they want it and ask for it. If they don't ask, then we're to keep our minds on our own affairs, not theirs. And Paul says to mind your own business. Because, folks, whether you realize this or not, there's already somebody working with them. And that somebody is God. and you're going to interfere in that. Our interference in another person's life might be complicating the work that God's doing. And whether we realize it or not, whether we've made this association or not, our meddling in another person's affairs, you know what that says about us, the meddler? It says that we have more confidence in our own solutions than we have in God's solutions. You know what that's called? Idolatry. That's idolatry, folks. When you think you're smarter than God and your decisions are better than His, you've made yourself God. When you think your wisdom is above His, you're starting to see why maybe God's got an issue with some of this stuff? God has a plan for that other person, and He's taken them step by step through this problem so that the person can learn from the experience, and then we come along and interfere in it. Think about this. Do we really want to bear the responsibility before God and answer to God for somebody else's temporal salvation? We want that responsibility? Do we really want to bear the responsibility for someone else's character growth? Do we want to be the one to make or break that person's relationship with God? Do we want to be, let's say, the third person that steers that person away from their relationship with God to a relationship with us and bust the family wide open? Is that what we want to be? We want to see ourselves in that light and answer to God for it? God's got a covenant relationship with every one of His children. We come along riding a white horse and wearing our white hat with the best of intentions to go in there and help that person out. And you know what we're actually doing? We're paving the road to hell for that person. And we're interfering in what God's doing, interfering with His work. Proverbs chapter 26 and verse 17 says, "He that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears." I read that verse, and you all know I have a basset hound, right? And his ears are longer than his tail. If he was a human, they would start here and go down to my knees. And hound dogs like it when you rub their ears. They love it. It sends off endorphins into their brain, and it kind of gives them a little high. So bassets love this stuff. But you take Josh had a dog named Jobin that we lost a few weeks ago, an Australian cattle dog, and he had those little short pointy kind of ears, right? And all you had to do with Jobin, if you just rubbed one of the hairs, just barely touch one of the hairs on the top of Jobin's ears, he'd start snarling at you and show his teeth. Dogs don't usually like it when you grab them by the ears. You know what's about 3 inches away from those ears? Some really big, sharp teeth. So what God's saying here, you go meddle in somebody's affairs, it's going to come back to bite you. And it will. Now, you're starting to see why this is serious? It's serious before God. Now, over the course of this, we've seen that meddling or being a busybody in other men's matters is probably a lot more serious than we previously thought. It's a lot more serious than I thought. It directly or indirectly breaks the first commandment, idolatry, presumptuousness, self-exaltation, putting ourselves in place of God and worshiping ourselves, thinking that our solutions to somebody's problems are better than God's. That's idolatry in a nutshell. We saw in 1 Thessalonians 4:12 that when we become a meddler and create problems, then we're a poor witness. And we're in fact taking the name of the Lord our God in vain. When I left the Missionary Baptists so many years ago, you all know the story about my dad standing up and arguing that a man needed to be put out of the ministry as a result of what he'd done. He committed adultery in a hotel room at one of those conventions. But you know, there was something else. There's another reason why I never set foot in another church and swore that I never would. Now, I did go to a church to see a wedding, and I went to a church because they had good-looking girls. So I did that for a while, but I had no intention of going to church again. It wasn't that I didn't believe in Jesus Christ. I believed in him since I was 3 years old. It was because I didn't like the people. They were judgmental, looking down their nose, and had their nose in everybody's business. Bad witness. Word spreads. Somebody finds out you're a meddler and you pretend to be a Christian? It's a bad witness. And you're taking the name of the Lord thy God in vain. That breaks another commandment. I mentioned before, it breaks the fourth commandment in terms of idleness and not working. It breaks the ninth commandment, bearing false witness, because usually it goes hand in hand with tale-bearing and gossip and a bunch of other stuff. So it's not a minor offense at all. It's a crime. And in several ways, not only does it break these commandments, but it does something else. It can destroy your relationship with God, or at least severely harm it. And it can destroy or severely harm your relationship with your brethren. It can shatter it. I've taught you folks that when somebody shows you who they are, believe them. Now, we're commanded by God to forgive our brethren for their transgressions. And we're to do that. I preached a sermon on forgiveness here not that long ago. If you forgot about it, go back at the YouTube channel and take a look at it. It's important not only before God, but it's also important so that you don't destroy yourself with bitterness. We are to forgive. Forgiveness is free. Do you know what's not free? Friendship and trust. Those aren't free, folks. Those are earned. And you can spend everything you got in the bank by putting your nose where it doesn't belong. I think about that nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty, remember him, the egg on the wall? And he falls off the wall, and you got this picture of this egg just absolutely shattered and broken. And it says, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Sometimes meddling in someone's affairs can drive a wedge so deep that they may never speak to you again. They may completely cut you out of their life. Now, they'll forgive you. I'll talk to you when we get to heaven, but I'm done with you down here on earth because I don't trust you. Because if you're going to meddle in my affairs, anything I tell you is apt to get to anybody else on planet Earth. Now, we've spent a bunch of time here talking about what we shouldn't be doing. So what should we be doing? Turn to Philippians 2 and verse 12. How about that? We're already there. Didn't even have to turn. Philippians 2 and verse 12. This is a really good place to start. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Read that again. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Folks, we got enough on our own plate not to be eaten off of somebody else's. Our Christian lives are full of minute-by-minute decisions that we need to be making relative to us. And they all have something to do with our own salvation. And if we're getting involved in somebody else's life, we're probably neglecting our own. So if we keep ourselves busy, we do the work at hand, which is our own Christian life, our own walk before God, then we're going to stay out of these disastrous messes that interfere between God and his other children. Don't we have enough problems of our own? I do. I got plenty of them. I don't need yours. Now, I'm the pastor. I have to have yours. But if I wasn't, I don't want them. I don't want more problems than I've already got. It just comes with the job. Your job doesn't come with that. Turn to 2 John and look at verse 8. I know I've gone a little bit longer than I usually do, but I'm just about ready to wrap this up. 2 John verse 8, I know this is a little out of context, but still I think it makes the point really well. Look to yourselves. Look to yourselves, that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. You know, you could live a life as a Christian for, 50 years, build up a sterling reputation with everybody else in the church and completely ruin it just by doing this once. Don't throw all the effort that you've done your entire life away. Don't take all the treasures that you've built in heaven over the course of your life and then lose them because of this. Look to yourselves, that we lose not those things which we have wrought, but that we receive a full reward. Now, I told you at the very beginning of this that if you discover that you're guilty of this, your response is this. What you should do is just go to God and apologize and promise that you're not going to do it again. It's easy enough, right? God will forgive it. Might be a little bit harder if you've offended someone down here, but as far as God, He'll forgive you for it. Now, I also told you that I was going to give you a tip on how to not do this again. When I was a child, some of the older people in the room will remember this. When I was a child, almost everybody had a telephone. Almost. But you only had one, and it was usually in the kitchen. And it was on a table, or it was in a little alcove, or it was hanging on the wall, right? And everybody in the family used that one phone. Now, if it were like that today, this would be the place that I would tell you to do what I'm going to tell you to do. But we don't do that anymore. We have cell phones, and so we don't have the one phone. Some people, rich people, had extension phones. I remember my sister, when she became a teenager, my dad got an extension phone for her. It was still the same phone line. You still had to wait till she got off the phone to use it. But she had an extension phone in her bedroom, and that phone had a cord on it that would reach the back wall. You could go all over, it was like a cell phone almost. As long as you were within reach of it, you'd climb out the window with it and talk to your friends when you don't want anybody to hear you, you know? But we don't have that these days. But everybody has a place where they usually hang out when they're on the phone. We all have a favorite chair. We all have a favorite place where we spend most of the time when we're in our house. I know where Wendy's is. The first place I go, I know, and if she's not there, then I know where she is. She's in the other place. If she's looking for me, the first place she goes is into my study, because I'm usually sitting at that chair in front of my desk. I'm not there all the time, but that's usually where I am, and that would be where I would make a phone call from. And any of you that have talked to me on my cell phone know that, because cell service in that location is horrible. But that's where I usually make the call. So y'all have a place like that, okay? So you decide where the place is, and then tomorrow, don't do it today. You're to rest today. Tomorrow I want you to go to a hardware store, okay? And I want you to buy one of these. This is called a ball peen hammer. You see, it's got this little round thing. It's also a machinist's hammer. It's made for working with metal. So go buy one of these. And I want you to set it next to where you would make that call. Don't cover it up. Don't put it in a drawer. You want it right there, handy and accessible. And the next time you get the hankering to pick up the phone and meddle in someone's affairs, I want you to take that hammer in your dominant hand with this little round part pointing out, and I want you to hit your opposite thumb with it, just as hard as you possibly can. It's going to hurt. It is going to hurt. The screaming and the crying and the cussing will probably only last for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. The throbbing will go away after maybe a week. The blueness will go away after a month, and it'll take you probably 6 months to grow a new nail. So for that amount of time, you've got a reminder of what not to do. And then 6 months later, you might have to do it again. Now, it's going to hurt. It'll probably hurt worse than anything you've ever felt in your life, but you know what? Now that you know how serious this is, it won't hurt half as much as if you make that phone call and God gets his razor strap after you. That I can guarantee, because now you're without excuse and you know better. With that, I thank you for your very kind and patient attention this morning.